Ernest Drucker, doctor estadounidense, director de la División de Salud Pública, Montefiore Medical Center, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, en Nueva York. Sus investigaciones como psicólogo clínico están centradas en los problemas sociales, reformas legales respecto a las drogas y derechos humanos. Además, es un estudioso del uso de drogas y las políticas de drogas en los Estados Unidos y en el exterior.
It's good to see you from this vantage point. I'm very pleased to be here at really is a historic meeting. Having been doing this for almost 30 years now, I've never been in a meeting which had so much frank discussion of the realities, the problems of those realities, and the need for a new reality, which we have to create. But don't get the idea that there's some other place where they're doing a better job than this. There isn't. Forward? No, that's not me. That's me. Okay, my colleague mentioned this quotation before. It's talking about past presidents. This is a very important one. And I've known this quotation for a long time. It was first from in some Chilean poetry, I read it. And the idea that the relationship between the United States and Mexico, the geography of it, I'm a geographer among other things, is so important, has suddenly become even more important because of the existence of these products, these drugs produced in South America, and what stands between South America and North America is Mexico. And so I want to look at this relationship and try to look at it in a more hopeful way. That President Diaz's comment about the disadvantage of Mexico may not need to continue into the future. And part of the point I want to make here is that the terrible kind of suffering that's going on in Mexico now around this situation actually is paralleled by what's happened in the United States. I'm an epidemiologist, and this is a meditation in a way on the war on drugs in Mexico and the United States as an epidemiological public health issue, which is the way I see things. And the solution of moving away, taking advantage of our proximity rather than it having to be a liability, if only because it will pressure the United States into dealing with its appetites and its markets and its demand, which is unquestionably the stimulus for everything that's going on here with violence. That violence is all too well known to you. The quality of these murders are not the quality of homicides in the usual criminal sense, one at a time. Most are between people who know each other. Most are crimes of passion. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an organized, strategic, and tactical approach to killing people, to spread terror and fear and obedience to the market model that's in place. We're by very, very vicious people, driven to that state by many conditions we can talk about, but there they are. And the evidence speaks for itself in the murder rate, the 50,000 homicides in the last 5 years, the 1,000 a month or more right now. And this is what in epidemiology we call an outbreak. And you can view this period of intense increase in the murder rate in Mexico. It's most of it up in northern Mexico, as our colleague showed yesterday with that map, of the focus of it having a clear relation to the transshipment of drugs into the United States. So these are the zones of the highest rates of homicide in Mexico. You know them all too well. And here's the actual numbers state by state, and you can see that the rates of homicide are dramatically different from states. And the idea of taking the rate for an entire country is a way of obscuring the more important reality, because we all live in a state. We don't live in Mexico or the United States. We live someplace in Mexico or the United States. And if that place has a murder rate of 100 per 100,000, life is quite different than if it has a rate of 2 or 3 or 7. That's the experience of living in a war zone. Very different. I was in Beirut, Lebanon last year, just when the war in Syria started. And it was very strange to be in this prosperous city, very much like Mexico City, active, new buildings, good cars, good food, And 25 miles away was beginning what's going on in Syria now. The region, the idea that Mexico is part of a region is very important, because that region has among the highest rates of violence in the world at this point, especially of guns. It's hard, what controls the, oh, there it is, okay. It's hard for you to read, I'm sorry, I couldn't get a better copy of it, but Colombia, Honduras, El Salvador, then South Africa, Brazil, these are the highest rates of gun homicide. The United States, Mexico is here at 5, and the United States is just a little lower at 4. I always thought the United States had the highest rates of gun homicide, and how wrong I was. So the role of guns, and we know that they're part of the economy of the drug markets, payment in guns. But there's a pretty good base of armament available in Central America already, and has been for quite a while, given the history of civil conflicts, armed civil conflicts that have gone on in Central America for so long. But here are the homicide rates for North and Central America. The U.S., 5 to 10, and we'll get into that in some detail later, because I want to mainly talk about violence in the United States associated with the war on drugs. And Mexico, 18 to 21, in that range. And Central America averaging 25, a bit higher than Mexico, not including Mexico, but the Honduras and Salvador having very, very, very high rates, 3, 4, 5 times those of Mexico. So that's the neighborhood in which you live here in Mexico. And you know all too well that what happens in those parts, in those countries, affects what happens here. And that you can begin to see the whole region from the producing zones of the Andes and South America all the way to the consuming zones in North America, with the exception of cannabis, which is being produced in North America now more than it is anywhere else, actually. But look at the United States figures over time. These are the numbers of homicides, and I give you the numbers, not just the rates, so the rates are the fair way to compare numbers, to take over the total number of population that's at risk for having this thing happen. But look at the change over time in the United States. From a rate of 9,000 homicides when the population was smaller. Population is over 300 million in the United States now, and back then it was about 200 million, to give you a sense of scale. But the country had to deal with 9,000 homicides a year, and these were old-fashioned homicides. 85% of them were people who knew each other, often crimes of passion, and certainly individual affairs, and well understood as a crime. I don't think that the homicides that are taking place in Mexico now are best understood as a crime. I mean, obviously, in a larger sense, they're terrible violations of humanity, which what violent crimes are. But the purpose behind them, the organization behind them, the methods, the marketing are very distinctive. But look what happens to the numbers. Between 1960, a jump to 7.9% by 70, 10.2, it's the peak in 1980 actually, and then stays up there. The population grows, but the number of murders remains about the same. So it actually isn't actually a decline, even though the rate has gotten, it's an artifact, because most of those new population in the United States are babies and newborns. And the idea that you have a sustained period of, let's say from 1970 through 2000, and it settles back to 14,000 and a rate of 4.8%. And if this was a baseline, you could say this is a return to baseline. And I became very interested in these 30 years that elapsed in between those two. And what was going on in that period of time that accounted for this big expansion of homicide. And while it can't be attributed to a single cause like the advent of the drug markets, because 1960s marked the beginning of drug availability in the United States and the beginnings of the war on drugs, which gains momentum by the 70s and is in full force by the 80s and 90s. There's 400,000 homicides. And if this rate had continued throughout that 10,000 a year, you'd have only had half as many. So if you put those numbers together, they tell you that in this period of time, and I'll show it to you another way now, if I get this to go properly. This is a very funky old picture of it, but it makes an important point, that these peaks, there was a previous peak in homicide, which was the period of alcohol prohibition. You can't see the numbers. This is 1900, 1920s. This is the alcohol prohibition, the Al Capone era. Settles down through the Depression, and then the 1950 is here, and then picks up again. This is the beginning. This 1990s. This is the beginning of the drug use and drug period, and you can see that there's an association in time between these two periods of homicide increase with two periods of drug prohibition in the United States. Not the only thing that was going on, but definitely was going on in this period. Just to give you a sense of the specifics of how this population who's being murdered in America is, you see an enormous difference between the African American rate and the white rate, really 5-6 times the rate of homicide. And so just like you look at a concentrated area numerically in terms of what to determine a rate of homicide, you also look at who in those areas, what kind of people, what age. We don't talk about pregnancy data for men. Only women get pregnant. Likewise, in the United States, the risks associated with being African American, many of them, including life expectancy, infant mortality rate, every disease is higher in African Americans, independent of economic status, and homicide is one of those. And I'll get to the other important one soon. But here's one display of the data of the murder rates from 1900 through 2000 with these two bumps. And this continues into this lovely chart by Al Blumstein, who's really, I think, the leading criminologist in the United States at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And what you see here is what Al has done is to delineate these peaks in two variables, robbery rates and murder rates. You see they pretty much follow each other, and that's an important part. Murder rates don't operate independently of other crimes. Violent crimes, for example, track the same way, which is assault and rape and those things. They track very similarly to homicide. So it's the homicides are the tip of an iceberg. For every homicide, there's 4 or 5 other violent crimes going along with it. So it's an environment, an ecology. And you see this peak of the murder rate at the time of the crack wars, and the demand begins to decline, and with it, and the very important thing about the decline of crack in the United States, which everyone takes credit for enforcement, but in fact had more to do with the recognition by communities that were beset by this problem that it was intolerable. I don't have any of the pictures here, but the graffiti on the walls in the Bronx and in Brooklyn where I worked of the rest in peace, the murders. This drug it had the capacity to destroy its own reputation if you could get it out. And they did get it out, but at a terrible price. And communities began to actually turn on crack buyers and crack dealers. People who sold and bought heroin looked down their nose at the crack users, and in many cases killed them in the streets of Brooklyn. So the decline in crack, in a way, was community awareness and community action about it in many places, although it was also true that places where, someone mentioned getting a cigarette with methamphetamine in it, there were places where you used to be able to go and buy spare joints, marijuana cigarettes in the street, and suddenly what they were selling was little vials of crack. And one of those places was the corner I live on, and they were littered with the little crack vials in the street. And I heard the same story from Peter Cohn, who'd gone to Brazil at this same time. And there used to be, in the favelas, you'd go up the road, and there was a table where the guys had some cannabis and hashish for sale, and some guy with a gun standing behind to stand guard on it. And he went back one year. Peter's a fine drug researcher from Amsterdam. Went back one year, same table, same guy with a gun, but on the table was bazooka and crack. And one of the rules about drug use and drug markets is, especially for kids, they'll buy whatever's there, and they'll use whatever's there. there was a heroin drought in Australia about 10 years ago. And suddenly all the heroin users were buying amphetamines because that's what was there. You wouldn't think that the drug would have, one drug guy who uses one drug would appeal, the stimulant would appeal to him, but it's there and it has an effect. And suddenly they had a big methamphetamine problem on their hands. So this association and this period of the drug wars and drug prohibition as part of a larger complex of increased punitiveness, laws that gave mandatory sentences and put many, many people in prison. This is the period where imprisonment grows, and I'll say a bit about that now, is associated with a huge increase in violent crime. And my estimate for the United States in this period is 200,000 extra homicides that wouldn't have been there if whatever was going on hadn't happened. And I say that because it wasn't some natural history. It rose, it stayed there, and then it went away. And what was the difference in that was the ferocity of enforcement, the existence of street markets, because a lot of markets moved indoors in response to police pressure. The drug rates didn't go down, but drug use rates didn't go down, but the homicides associated with them did. Now, prisons. This is a book I've published in the last few months about the epidemiology of mass incarceration in America. You can get it at plagueofprisons.com. Buy the T-shirt, see the movie. The story of this is looking at the epidemic of incarceration in the United States in just those terms, because what we realize is that once incarceration took off under mandatory sentences, that it continues to grow on its own. You reach some critical mass, network effects begin to occur. And sentences are based on predicates. So at the first time you do an offense, you get 3 years, or you may even get off. But the next offense, they double the sentence, then double it again. So you get people with longer and longer sentences. And in New York State, which I know best, the proportion of drug offenders entering prison went up from 6% before the 1970s, when the Rockefeller drug laws, the very harsh mandatory sentencing laws came into effect, went up to about 40% of all new admissions to prison were drug-related. Nonviolent drug offenses. This is not stealing a car to get money for drugs. This is being arrested for having possession of drugs, often at quantities sufficient to get you indicted for sales. They determine intent to sell by the amount of drugs, and those have higher penalties with them. But once you come back the second time and the third time, which you will because you have this chronic recurrent condition called drug dependence perhaps, you fill up the system. And this saw this dramatic growth of the U.S. prison system from 200,000 people to over 2 million people in the course of this same period of time. Another variable, another one of the impacts on the health of and life, and we call this mortality data, is lethal drug overdoses. And these are the rates per 100,000. And you see the sharp increase in the period here, beginning just about the time that the war on drugs begins to diminish. You see this phenomenon happening, and it's very particular because it represents the shift in markets that a few people have mentioned here before, from botanical products to pharmaceutical products. And here you see some differentiation of that. We're close to 40,000 drug overdose deaths a year now in the United States, similar to the automobile fatality rate. But increasingly, the pharmaceutical projects, this is just one of the classes of them, opioid analgesics, drugs like OxyContin, begin to outstrip heroin and cocaine, which are dramatically lower. And actually, cocaine, the cocaine rate going down. And what these are combinations of pain-killing medications, tranquilizing medications, and very often because they stop working after about 3 or 4 months as acute pain medications, people begin supplementing them with other drugs, relaxants and tranquilizers, and the lethal blends of these drugs that take a very, very high toll. I did a study in northern Pennsylvania about 10 years ago of overdose deaths, and the profile was late 30s, white, working class men who had had some history of drug use before, and they were dying with no heroin in their system, but these prescription opiates and 5 or 6 other drugs on average. So you begin to see this stream of production coming out of the pharmaceutical industry, which is heading towards $1 trillion market, by the way. I read in The Economist recently. The growth of the pharmaceutical industry in the world and its product lines, which are promoted very aggressively, coincides with the reduction in price and value of that Alex showed you of the botanical drug markets. And I think we're heading towards a future where poor people use things that are based on free products that can be grown in a garden somewhere, and people who can afford it will get customized, tailorized drugs. And you can imagine as these drugs get refined over the coming decades, where you have a genetic profile that says which drugs you're responsive to, and the genetic engineering of these drugs is focused on this kind of depression, with this kind of trajectory, or this kind of anxiety, with that kind of trajectory. I'll just give you an example. The prescription of antidepressant drugs in the United States increased 400% in the last 4 years. That's extraordinary. And that alone represents an $18 billion a year market, to give you a sense of scale. So it's clear where the trends of these markets are going, and the older illicit drugs are being swept along with it in combination, but when people can't get those, they get these. So kids who are prescribed Ritalin for hyperactivity disorder, those drugs are diverted into the school markets of young kids. And they're all over the place in medicine cabinets. In fact, one of the turns in the United States as a response to the ending, there's an end of welfare support in the United States. There's no pretense in the United States that the society has any obligation to the sick and the poor. You have to prove your worthiness to get support. There's no safety net is a term that's used. It's gone. So one of the things that happens is you become eligible for housing support, food support, medical care support if you're certified as being disabled by the Social Security Administration. And to be disabled for something wrong with your arm or your leg, you really have to be disabled. But the new category is psychiatric disabilities, mental disabilities. And the way you have a mental disability is you have a prescription for psychiatric drugs. That's the confirmatory evidence that you need public assistance. So of course, anthropologist Philippe Bourgeois, a wonderful anthropologist in Philadelphia, said, first these poor people had to learn to be poor, then they had to learn to be drug addicts, now they have to learn to be crazy in order to qualify for public assistance, which they, of course, the only way they can feed their children. And so you see the interaction between drug markets and much larger issues in the society. I'm ending with this because here for Mexico again, because it doesn't just show the bodies, it shows the response. Had a wonderful opportunity last night to sit with people from this organization and the heroic job they're doing in defending the possibilities of some kind of redemption for people who have gotten caught up in the kidnapping and murders in a judicial system that apparently can't respond to them. And I think civic action and life in the civic sphere is the first place to look in Mexico, where there's so much to be done and can be done. And I think the MUCD people are an absolutely wonderful a model of that. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Como vamos a proceder a las preguntas y respuestas, primero voy a hacer un par de preguntas generales para los tres ponentes y después les pediría que contestaran las preguntas que hayan escogido entre las que les llegaron directamente. La primera pregunta, y que salió entre algunas de las preguntas del público, es ¿qué determina la prevalencia del consumo de drogas en la sociedad? Se mostraron gráficas de diferentes ciudades y de diferentes países. En todas hay esquemas de prohibición parecidos, pero en diferentes momentos hay más o menor consumo de drogas. Entonces, si no es la prohibición, ¿qué es lo que determina cuánto se consume? La segunda pregunta es, en las decisiones que toman las personas sobre consumir o no consumir drogas, ¿qué papel juega la información pública? Larry, un poco de broma, dijo: la prevención no se trata de que vaya un oficial de la policía a un salón de clases y diga la marihuana hará que te salgan cuernos, pero ¿qué información sí hace que la gente cambie las decisiones que toma con respecto a las drogas? En particular se mencionó, digamos como un ejemplo, la caída en el consumo de crack como una decisión tomada en comunidades a partir de información que proveía la misma sociedad y no necesariamente información que proveía el gobierno. Entonces, si quieren, empezamos con Alex y vamos en el mismo orden, y después con las preguntas que les hayan llegado en papel también las contestamos en el mismo orden. Gracias.
I think Alex has covered most of the territory, but another feature of it is that decisions about using a drug or any drug or doing other things other behaviors like having sex are not necessarily made alone, especially by young people when habits get established and attachments to different ideas and drugs happen. So you have to look at peer network effects, and that may be more powerful than the particular drug. The drug that's available will become popular in a group, and I remember when I was in high school, there were kids who drank and there were kids who smoked dope, and they were different crowds, and they had different significance to them. Then there are phenomena associated also with groups. In alcohol consumption in bars, there's pretty good research showing that the heaviest drinker in a group determines the drinking level of the whole group. Let's have another round, let's fill up, and they drive the situation. But other phenomena in bars also, the noise level, music, increases alcohol consumption. Every tavern owner knows that. Keep the music loud, can't talk, drink. As far as the education and information is concerned, there's all kinds of ways to give information. You know, you're dating my daughter, and I'm going to give you some information. If you don't stop seeing her, I'm going to kick your ass down the stairs. It's information, you know. And then the credibility of the source of the information, and you lied to us, you know, common line, you lied to us about marijuana, so we thought we could do what we want with cocaine, which goes back to the crack issue again, which was very striking, with people scrambling around to take credit for the decline in crack. But all the evidence I could ever see in the Bronx and Brooklyn, where I looked pretty closely and worked with people who worked in the street with users, this drug became unavailable in many neighborhoods, whereas in other neighborhoods in exactly the same city, this crack continued. And one of the big differences was the Jamaican drug dealing gangs in Brooklyn stopped selling crack. They moved to heroin, actually, whereas formerly they'd only sold marijuana. In the Bronx, the Dominican group that controlled the drug markets in the street continued to sell crack. Chicago, crack appeared 3 or 4 or 5 years later than it did in New York, because the groups that sold drugs there sold heroin, and they resisted the input from new distributors and didn't have crack available. When it was available, it took off. And it took off especially among very poor people, because it was available for 50 cents a hit on a pipe, or in exchange for oral sex. You know, you create markets. So it's like any other commodity or any other taste that gets developed. It's very, very subject to fashion. Well, first question had to do with education and its effect on people's decisions to consume drugs or not. And I think that we desperately need a drug education model which is based on an acknowledgement of the fact that teenagers experiment with drugs. We think of drug education for teenagers and preteens. That's something other than scaring kids, because we know that doesn't work very well. And the idea that you could build a drug education program on the recognition that kids and their friends will be using drugs. I think it was Don McPherson yesterday said, "Don't do it," or Ethan said, "Don't do it, don't do it." But if you do it, here's what you need to know. And that's a very difficult thing to insert into schools and educational curricula where prohibition reigns, and in a society where prohibition, militant prohibition, is the norm. And you lose your job as a teacher if you imply that you can have a discussion based on people using drugs without being blanket disapproving of that, and to be able to differentiate between the kind of experimentation with drugs, which is almost universal with kids, and how to inform that behavior without being too judgmental about it. That's the thing that turns them off. Another question was about whether there was possible to discern an effect during alcohol prohibition. I'm not a scholar of that, but discern an effect of changes in alcohol consumption and the effect of that upon mortality, on death rates, because clearly there's, less consumption can be generally dose-related for a population is associated with safety. But I'm struck with that, so there's no clear answer to that, because during Prohibition, the quantity of alcohol isn't just what changed. The types of alcohol that were available, if you were a bootlegger, it made more sense to bring spirits in a more concentrated, condensed form, took up less space, didn't smell as much as beer. So if you're going to bring a truckload of bootleg liquor in, you're better off doing it with whiskey than with beer. And that shifted consumption patterns. At the end of Prohibition, consumption patterns came out different. The speakeasy was the place where cocktails became popular. The other question had to do with the treatment of terminal cancer in teens and the use of drugs for that. And we have a chronic problem with pain medication, in that study after study for 50 years shows that pain medication is inadequate in most clinical settings and hospitals. And now with the new potent pain medications being aggressively marketed, part of that overdose pattern I talked about is that of doctors not knowing how to manage these drugs. The manufacturer is really pushing them rather than showing them how to manage them. Pain management is not a trivial business. We've probably all had family members and ourselves had incidents where we needed pain managed. And the classic model of how to do that well is to confer control of the medication on the patient. The button you push in the hospital to get a dose when you want it, because a lot of the feeling of pain is the anxiety about not believing that you'll get adequate medication to stop the pain. So the use of pain medications in anybody, including teens, is still out there, and it's subject to the prohibitions on the use of opiates and the doctors who worry they will get in trouble if they overprescribe. And in the United States, at least, I don't know what it's in other countries, in the United States, with the computer files on prescriptions, the DEA does very tight surveillance on prescriptions of pain medications. Doctors become known as pain doctors. Some of them are pain doctors. Some of them are really just trading on their license to prescribe, and they'll give the patients what they want, or they'll go to another pain doctor. More commonly, I know it's true in Australia where people doctor shop. They can go to different doctors, different prescriptions. I don't know if the computer systems have caught up to them, but the net effect is to damp down the availability of pain medications. The question for teens, it raises the question of marijuana, because marijuana has some important properties in terms of alleviating pain and stresses associated with pain. And probably most of us who ran drug programs have had requests from people to get cannabis for their grandmothers who are having cancer, chemotherapy, and are suffering with that, and are given drugs, Marinol, that are less effective than consumed cannabis. Some of the clubs in the United States, the medical marijuana programs, are beginning to make inroads into this, but a strange situation of having to smuggle cookies to an 85-year-old woman who's in cancer. Why should that be a legally fraught situation? There was another question here about the regulated markets, how regulated markets can trigger the use of drugs and which drugs must be accessible. And just end with a story from Hawaii. which used to be a place where they gave away cannabis on the beaches because it grew wild everywhere and very inexpensive, widely used. But Hawaii is also the home to very big United States Air Force bases where they try out all their surveillance equipment. And they got to a point where they could identify the signature of a single cannabis plant from 30,000 feet. And they completely suppressed marijuana in Hawaii in the 90s. And immediately, the vacuum was filled by a far more dangerous drug, crystal meth, and began a period that's still going on. I saw an extraordinary story. I was in Hawaii a few months ago, that Hawaii is spending $500 million a year on methamphetamine treatment, imprisonment, diagnosis. It didn't go away. There's cannabis there as well through the usual market mechanisms, but it sure isn't free on the beach anymore. So you know, the effects, these are the things we need to learn about. It's not like we know about the way markets for drugs that are now illicit and where decisions are made about which drugs to use based on availability and the assurance of availability and the price and the circumstances. You know, so a pill is a much safer drug to take than it is to smoke a joint in a public space because it smells. But the pill may be far more dangerous. So the decisions about drugs are shaped by prohibition policy as much as anything else.